I'm Megan.
I'm CJ.
And I'm Erica.
And this is the Her Podcast.
Today we're sitting down with physiotherapist and owner of STILL Physio here in Saskatoon, Kim Fraser. Kim's passion for women's health and sport performance is what drives her to help her clients navigate, heal, and listen to their bodies pre- and postpartum. Her expertise and advocacy has her working with elite and Olympic athletes, women of all ages, and creating new education methods to redefine pelvic floor care and sports performance for women. We went all over the place with Kim. She explained what our pelvic floor is, what an exam looks like, why it's important, and how it can actually affect so much of our body if we don't have it healed or have strengthened it properly. She went over with us what we need to know as we age, what most women don't know about pelvic floor care, and why we need to focus on preventative care and training versus just reactive. Buckle up for this one. Kim was so sweet, and we know you guys are going to love her.
Where's the camera?
It's hiding. See? You can't even tell you're being filmed.
Like the camera?
Yeah.
It's the phone.
Yeah.
It's a phone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're super excited to have you on today.
Thank you.
And obviously you own STILL Physio.
It is a physio clinic. Yes.
Yes.
It is
Hence
just me.
the name. Just you.
For
which
now.
Is amazing.
Yeah. We talked about, I think it was you talking to me about for now. And I probably, I chose a space that was small and really personal and really safe for my patients to be in. So maybe one day it will expand, but where my kids are in their era of life, I'm pretty still and happy just having a really simple space that I can call my own and can put my own plants and soap in.
Oh my goodness,
That
I
is
love
key.
that.
That is key.
Where did the name STILL Physio come from?
There's so many reasons I came up with STILL. In fact, I didn't actually like the name when I first decided it, but you know how sometimes it's like a mega time crunch to incorporate your business or get everything started. So I was like, oh, how do I choose this name? And I started to think of these words on my wall, and I could see a clinic, and I actually don't have these words on my wall yet, but I wanted to see the words like a still mother, a still athlete, or the words still sport. And that really came up with a couple of reasons. I have had 3 kids, and I'm a runner. I was a dancer before I was a runner. And I had this injury that stopped me from running, and it happened when I had my second child. I ended up prolapsing my pelvic floor, returning to sport too fast. And because of that, I was so sad that I couldn't do the things that I really love to do, or I was really fearful. And I remember saying to myself, you might not be able to do that right now, but you will be able to do that one day, or I still can, or I'm not really capable right now, but I will be capable again. So that still component, when people come see me, there's moments where they are unable to do the things that they love that brings them joy in their day. And so there's moments where I'll say, you will do this again. You are still capable. It's just we have a small pivot in the road. So that was one big thing. Those words, I still can, I might not be able to right now, but it will come again, was something that I kind of held on really tight. And then the still sport side was really important to me. I found that I worked in a very busy sport clinic, and I was so fortunate to work in a clinic like this. I got to see anyone interested in sport, from recreational individuals that were just new to an activity, new to running, to high performance athletes that were Olympic athletes, that were Paralympic athletes, that were on team sports. And I would see every age category from 11-year-old girls to even 71-year-old runners. And I found there was this culture of sport that still exists today, that it's always more is more is more. And I found that I started to work and understand the body in a very different way that I was trained in school. And I always had a dim room, and it was always really trying to understand the nervous system. And I had this one athlete come in to see me, and she said to me, "You remind me of a calm mom." And I said, "Well, girl, I'm not a calm mom, but I am a calm physio." And she really had a moment that someone was taking care of her when she was training 4 to 6 hours a day. And I think sometimes in the sport of physio, especially in the sport of physio, with sport, more is always more. Let's train more, and let's treat harder. Let's be more aggressive with what we're doing. And I was really finding that, especially these young females, were not getting a moment to pause and just take some recognition of how they were feeling, nor were they given permission to do that. And so I found that the sessions they had with me, we were able to just make some massive changes because their nervous system was saying like, okay, this is a moment for me to be still. And in the osteopathic world, there's a thing called the still point. And the still point is when, if I'm working on someone, there's nothing creating resistance in the body. It's like a moment of complete stillness where the body is super settled. And that I'm always consciously looking for with anyone that comes sees me, because when there's stillness, there's progress, right? So that's where the whole still physio really lit up in my life. And I really love that it's called that now.
That's so beautiful. I'm just like in awe.
I know.
Wow. I'm like, that's so nice. And finding the still point, I had never heard.
No, I've never heard of that
either.
before.
Of something like that.
I'm curious, when you realized that you were in this busy sport clinic, when did you realize that you were like, this is not it? And how did you find that stillness? What was the turning point for you?
So I took this course out in BC, and it was the most boringest labeled course. It was called the integration of the thorax and the pelvis. Like, that doesn't even sound exciting, but it was life-changing for me. And halfway through this course, we were introduced to the pelvic floor, and it was like 101 basic anatomy of it. There was no internal exams. There was no anything really. It was just like, this is the pelvic floor and this is how it relates to the rib cage or whatnot. And I just was like, oh, okay, cool. Like I wasn't a pelvic floor therapist then, and I didn't actually have a desire to be. I just was a sport physio, or I was a physiotherapist that worked in sport. And I got home from that course, and I was working with an NHL hockey player at the time, and he had a hip injury and he had a hip surgery, and he needed to get drafted really quickly to return back to hockey. And I remember where I worked at the time, there's this long hallway that leads into the gym. And it was 7 a.m. That's what time I worked. And I just kind of was walking through this hallway, and I saw him already there. He was already training. He was so motivated to improve. And I just stopped in this hallway as I saw him, and I tipped my head. I go, oh God, that's what I'm missing. The whole pelvic floor and hip performance. What is that about? What am I supposed to do with this? And so I happened to see him that day, and I said, I have an idea. And I said, I think there's something about pelvic floor that ultimately affects hip performance. And I said to him, there's only one way to do this in a man, and it's rectally. And he goes, no. And I was like, well, legally I can't anyway. I don't have any credentials or certifications, but like, that's my idea.
Right.
And oh my God, I'll never forget that look. But anyway,
he's like, I can only imagine.
No. But 3 months later, I was on a plane to Bellingham, Washington to understand pelvic health so I can improve hip performance and sport performance, especially in the field of running. And so when I learned that, when I had that moment that we were missing something important in performance, then that's when I really went on my own black sheep adventure. Like, I started to understand pelvic floor for the sport of movement. And then I started to do some visceral work and visceral education, because I was like, let me think, if the rib is always rotated this way, could it be because the liver is super being pulled? And then so learning that visceral system and the patience and the calmness you need with it to not blow past it, but to just be perceptive of it is when I kind of started practicing that way, and then starting to slow my culture of more is more, and do this exercise and do this exercise. It's more like, let's just take a moment to sit and talk about your day, you know? And so I think that's when I realized it with those two stories, with the hockey player and then the kidney issue. And I just started to really pivot my practice and start doing what was different.
Well, I mean, obviously you know this because you're in physio. I am not in physio, obviously. But I'm like, the body is so connected. And it literally blows my mind, you know, sitting down with people like you and others that we've talked to and books that I've read. And I'm like, how interesting I find it that one organ or one thing over here can connect to another. And sometimes in our healthcare system, or even like practitioners that we see, how discombobulated, you know, we look at only one area at a time, but how important it is to take in the person as a whole, right? And so it seems like you're sort of saying, yeah, like how much different areas of the body can impact, right? So like on your hip, talking about your kidney and like your liver and those types of things. Like, that's crazy.
I think I've always been really curious, and I remember I did this presentation for the OBGYNs, and I asked them, why don't you suture up when you do a C-section? Why don't you suture up all of the layers of the abdominal wall and not just some of them? And it took me 5 whys and asking this panel of people and saying like, well, why did you do that? And then they'll say something and I'll say, well, why about that? And then, well, why did you do that? And it took me about 5 or so whys for them to say, you know what, we used to. And when we attached all these layers of the fascia and the peritoneum and the not the organs, but the myofascial and muscle layers, then there was so much adhesion and so much scar tissue, and it created so much pain. And so when you start to understand the why and you're curious about it, and you start to just ask a little bit more and listen a little closely, then you start to see a lot of the signs that aren't there. And I always encourage other physios that I know and work with to keep asking and keep being curious, and don't take the courses that everyone else does, but take something that might interest you, or maybe your own personal experiences have led you to understanding more.
Well, and the more that you ask why and get curious, the more opportunity there is to learn something different and find a different way to do it.
Yeah.
I want to know more about the pelvic floor.
All
Yeah.
right. Okay.
I want to get into it because I feel like this is a
Kim's gotten into my pelvic floor. No, I'm just kidding.
well,
She's my physio, you guys.
I've had pelvic floor work. What do we say? Treatment.
Sure. Work routine.
Through. So I have 3 kids, and my last 2 pregnancies, I did it before birth and a little bit after. But so I know what happens when I go get that, but I'm really interested in the health of it, or the benefits of dealing with it, or when you should deal with it, or what does that look like?
Well, then you also have me who's never had pelvic floor. So I'm like, there's also maybe some listeners who are like,
what is this
or
even?
women who have had children that didn't know anything about the pelvic floor until after they had babies and things started feeling different, and then they were told something about a pelvic floor, like
Yes.
me.
Well, when I took my pelvic floor education, it really had the mindset of sport performance. That was the reason I ended up flying to Bellingham, Washington, was to be like, what is the correlation to the low back or chronic low back injuries and chronic hip injuries? And so with that education you have with the pelvic floor, it comes with maybe a prenatal client. It comes with a postpartum client. And so as I just developed my skills, I would see, athletes that didn't have kids, or athletes that had kids, or I would see prenatal or postpartum women. And it was so interesting. You almost don't realize it as you're going through that year or 2 of evolution. I remember nothing of my first year and 2, because I remember my first year and 2 being like, I'm in here. Where?
Okay, you should explain that though, because some people are like, what do you mean when you say you're in here?
Okay. So in my clinical setting, I make sure that the room, obviously I have windows in my clinic. The blinds are closed. We're not that kind of clinic, but I have a sheet that you will lie on and another sheet to make sure that you're not exposed and that you don't feel vulnerable and that you're comfortable. And so usually with the pelvic floor exam, I obviously wear gloves and I wear I use medical grade lubrication. And so sometimes I ask, obviously it's good information and clinical data for me to see what the vagina looks like, because there might be signs that one lip is being pulled to the side because maybe they have too tight of a hamstring or too tight of a hip muscle. So that happens a lot. And so I sometimes look for signs of atrophy, because sometimes when women are going through menopause, you'll start to see the labia, lips have less puffiness to them. They'll start to have a little bit of atrophy. And so I just want to see if there's symmetry and what's happening on with that. So I do look, and I do obviously ask my patients. Some of them are like, I'm not comfortable you looking. And so I said, that's fine. And so I just kind of go within the pelvic floor without me seeing. And so when I'm doing a pelvic floor assessment, I will, with your consent, obviously, and with stillness in my approach, taking our time, I will start to feel how, as I go a little bit deeper into the pelvic floor, into the vagina, where there is moments of tension or moments of a pull or restriction, I will feel where the bladder is resting to make sure that it's resting in an ideal position. I feel the tone of the bladder. I feel the tone of the muscles. I do test for a pelvic floor contraction, and I think that's what we're going to talk about, you and I, about why do I care about the strength of a pelvic floor, and is that relevant or not in my world? And so that's what a pelvic floor assessment is. And then they can last 15 minutes to maybe 30 or 45 minutes, depends on what I'm finding. But I've always said I can't change a pelvic floor without without also looking at the body as a whole. So most of the times if someone does come see me for a pelvic floor assessment on day 1, don't be surprised if I'm working on their ribs first, or I'm working on their breath, or working on their hip, or whatever it might be, even their head or their cranium, whatever it might be. But if that's usually what the pelvic floor assessment looks like.
As you're saying that, I'm like, I don't look at my girl enough. I don't know what's
Literally,
happening
I was
down
like,
there.
I'm gonna go home and like ask my husband. That's literally what I was thinking. We're gonna mirror. I'm like, can you tell me, am I balanced? Like, what's
Yeah, that's wild.
I've got a mirror.
Don't we got a mirror here?
Yeah, we do.
You do have a mirror here.
This is gonna be a whole different. We're gonna
Kim's
do
like,
a whole
I
different
thought
podcast.
I was doing a podcast.
Kim, did
Not
you
a
bring
session.
gloves?
Examinations.
Gloves? No. I did do a court. No, I'm not even going there.
Yeah, okay.
No, that
Yeah,
stays
yeah.
in the vault there. Okay.
Sorry.
So pelvic floor. So that's what an assessment looks like. And
Okay.
so my biggest job is not necessarily to massage or release muscles that are tight within the pelvic floor. Obviously, that is a pelvic floor, talking to other pelvic floor therapists. That's what we do for sure. But what's so interesting, and what a lot of women don't know about their pelvic floor, first of all, it's out of sight, out of mind, unless there's a problem, right? Yeah. We don't even know we have one. And you'll sometimes hear me on Instagram being like, hi, pelvic floor, are you there? I have no idea.
Yeah.
You're holding up fine? And so the pelvic floor is very autonomic. It's like the diaphragm. So the diaphragm, we can override the diaphragm. We could say, okay, stop breathing for a moment, right? We can all do that. But when we're not thinking about it, we inhale, we exhale with ease. We do our thing. We're inhaling, we're exhaling. The pelvic floor is the exact same musculature. It's type 1 fibers, it's level 1 fibers, and they're autonomic, they're reflexive, they're anticipatory. So if I were to go lift this microphone, and I'm thinking about it, I'm just going to go quickly lift that. My pelvic floor is like, okay, I'm going to prepare enough so I can support what you're doing and be there for you. Okay, so that's its job. But there's things that sometimes turn the pelvic floor off that make those muscles not reactive. And this is so common. So especially with pregnancy, these muscles have some of the muscles have a tendency to be like a light switch. It just turns right off. And so all of a sudden women would come see me. Maybe they were active before, they had a baby, they didn't think anything of it. And then all of a sudden they would come into my schedule a year later and they're like, what the hell? I feel terrible. My back hurts. My hip hurts. I'm not moving forward. I finally have time for myself and this is just not working. I don't feel good. Mm-hmm. And so I'd start to be like, okay, what is happening here? What is happening? And so I started to pay attention to how the pelvic floor is supposed to react. And we're going to do a little exercise, all of us, okay?
Oh my gosh. I'm so excited.
Okay. So it's
Right
funny.
now?
Yeah.
Yeah, right
If
now.
you're
Oh my
listening at
gosh.
home,
You should be watching this.
Okay.
you could
Okay.
be doing this activity with us.
Okay.
Hey everybody, Erica here to tell you about a luxury resale company that I'm obsessed with, Working Girls Boutique. I got introduced to them probably about a year ago and have been following it along and obsessing over all of their items ever since. You guys know I'm a sucker for a good bag and actually bought my first luxury handbag last year after crushing some amazing goals, and it was the perfect way to celebrate. Working Girls Boutique offers a stunning selection of gently loved luxury handbags and a safe, reliable, secure, reputable way to purchase, which is so important when making such a significant purchase. They have a strong commitment to authenticity and choose carefully curated pieces in excellent condition, including Prada, YSL, Chanel, and my favorite, Louis Vuitton. Ensuring authenticity of luxury items is no joke, and Working Girls Boutique prides themselves on thoroughly checking every item they choose. Trust me when I say I've spent my time looking through different brands and businesses that claim to do this, and Working Girls Boutique is the only business I would purchase from. They also offer flexible payment plans so you can secure your dream bag without breaking the bank. Plus, Working Girls gave us an exclusive discount code for you. Use code HER50 to save $50 off your purchase. You have to go look at the selection they currently have in stock. They have tons on their Instagram, and that's where I always see the new arrivals, but they also have a website with everything that is ready to go. I was just checking out a gorgeous classic Louis Vuitton Keepall, a stunning Chanel 19 bag with two-tone hardware that I absolutely love, and yes, I've sent screenshots to Nick because I'm always giving him gift ideas. Find details on the newest designer additions on Instagram at Working Girls Boutique, all one word, and head to their website, wgboutique.com, to secure your dream bag. Don't forget to use the code HER50 for $50 off your purchase. That's HER50 for $50 off your purchase. And side note, if you do snag a bag, please send me a photo because I love talking about this.
So how do we know if our pelvic floor is working if we're not having any signs of pelvic floor issues? Like we're not leaking, which is a common thing. If we're not peeing sometimes when we cough or sneeze, or we're not leaking when we're running or doing some activity or being on the trampoline, we might have pelvic pain when we have sex. We might have pressure when we work out down in our pelvic floor, or we might have this chronic low back pain, or we might have this chronic hip pain, or even a knee pain, which is really where my knee pain stemmed from, was my pelvic floor after I prolapsed. And right, you would never think that,
No.
right? And I was a runner, and so I'm really grateful that I had a team of people training me to return to running, but no one once considered me as a postpartum woman with a prolapse and a low back disc injury. So my whole unit was not working and hadn't worked for a while.
What does prolapse mean?
Prolapse can come in couple different forms. So a prolapse is when potentially your uterus drops a little bit, or your bladder drops a little bit, or your rectum. And there's a couple other prolapses, but the most common is when there's a weakness of a little bit of the walls of the vagina, and so there's a little bit of a drop that happens, and it's really frightening for women when they find out. And I'll be honest, in my case, I went to spin class too early postpartum, and I felt incredible after my second baby. There was no signs for me to ever feel not strong enough, and I was literally on a spin bike in the middle of a spin class. I think it was motion fitness, and I felt literally a grape fall out of me, and I said, oh no, oh no, oh no. And then I had to get up and I had to leave. And I phoned my friend Paula at the time, who was a pelvic floor therapist. And I phoned her at night and I said, Paula, I'm not okay. Something happened. And she was such a kind friend. She's like, come to the clinic tonight. I'll meet you there and we'll take a look. And my God, I beat myself up over that. Oh, that makes me emotional. I beat myself up over that for years because I was like, look what I did to myself. And I wish I would have known. And I think that's why I love doing what I do today, because I won't let that happen again as the best I can. You know, if I can help other women just to prevent that. And then I was scared to have a third baby, and it took me a little bit longer to have my third baby because I'm like, maybe I'm not peeing my pants now, but maybe because that integrity of that pelvic floor is not ideal, then I'm going to have some issues later, right?
Can I ask you a detailed question?
Sure.
So you say you felt like a grape fell out of you.
Yeah.
But that's like the physical dropping of...
It was my cervix.
Okay.
Yeah, it was my cervix, yeah.
But you know, this is a different tangent, which is like something else. But like this also speaks to, your story really speaks to the culture of like moms getting back.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And like our internal pressures, and how often when you're like, oh my gosh, look at her. Like she just like had a baby and she's like on a bike and it's like celebrated. And meanwhile, you're like, I have just injured my body.
Yeah.
And I don't know. And it's scary. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I don't even know if I processed other people's actions at the time because I was just so devastated about what had happened and how I let that happen. Like I chose to go there that day. Mm-hmm. And so it's really other clients that'll come to see me and they're like, you know what, I ran before and now I want to run again and I just want to do it really safely. And I know that you're going to be the person to help me do that. And they're like, you know what sucks is I'm seeing other runners on Strava and they're already doing things that I'm not doing. And I was like, I want you to be a long-lasting, sustainable runner. I want you running in your 70s. That matters more than 4 extra weeks. And they totally get it. And in this one case in particular, she was like, oh, Kim, it still sucks that I'm seeing other people do these activities. And then she came to see me one day, like a month later, and she goes, remember I told you about that one girl that was doing so much more than me? She's injured. She's out for the season. Mm. And I was like, that sucks to hear. And who's her team? You know, who's her team? And she didn't have a team. Like I didn't have a team that could help me talk about me as a postpartum woman. And I was trained and treated as an athlete. I was trained as a runner. And that was great. I'm a really darn good running coach now because I've psychoanalyzed everything about running to improve my knee. And it took me years to be like, wait a second, I've had this disc bulge since I was 16. I've had this prolapse. My knee pain started when the rest of my body completely fell apart. And then my knee pain was like, I can't do this anymore. What's your plan, girl? what's your
Figure it out.
together.
Get it together.
So you go get this exam with your friend or your friend who is a physio,
Yes.
pelvic floor physio. And this is where you're like,
And do you have pain with this prolapse?
No.
Okay.
I didn't really even have pressure. I could just feel, it was almost like a tampon's falling out of you. Yeah, that kind of thing.
been there.
Yeah, right.
What
And-
a strange feeling.
And what was troubling at the time is I went and saw a gynecologist, and she said to me, you know what, it's only a type 1 or level 1 prolapse. You're a physio. Go do your kegels. And I was like, I physically can't do a kegel. Like, I physically can't engage my pelvic floor. I physically can't do that. And I didn't know why at the time. And then now, knowing what I know now and the curiosity that I've led to, now I can figure that out. But no one was taking me from return to sport as a postpartum female with an injury, like a pelvic floor injury. And so that's why I do what I do.
Well, I'm curious with Kegels, and maybe there's not like a blanket, there's probably not a blanket statement answer that you can sort of give, but I'm like, can Kegels possibly be doing more harm than good depending on what your pelvic floor health is looking like?
Yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to do that exercise.
Okay.
And learn, obviously, the strength of a pelvic floor matters. Like, I have some really strong athletes that have terrible pelvic floors that aren't leaking, that are performing super well. So I was like, wait a second, how come I see pelvic floors that are super strong and they're peeing their pants? Why is this happening? So it's not necessarily a strength issue. It's a coordination issue. It's a pressurized system within our trunk that is allowing the pelvic floor to react like it's supposed to. So we're going to do an exercise and you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay. So do you guys, I always make this analogy. Oh my God, you guys, I have the worst analogies.
I love
go for
analogies.
it.
You have good analogies.
You don't even, she says the weirdest stuff.
You're
so
in
don't-
good
you're
company.
in good
You
company.
said the weirdest things.
Okay. I have a Tyra Banks smizing one lately.
Oh my God.
Like,
Oh, I want to hear it later.
okay. So you guys, have you ever seen those fruit baskets that you can hang and they have 2 tiers?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you guys have one?
No, but I can like,
I know.
I'm pretty sure like my grandma does.
Yes, right. Okay. So imagine you have this 2-tiered basket, right? So the top of the tier is your diaphragm. So it's like a dinner plate. It's this big circular plate.
Okay.
And then the bottom basket is your pelvic floor. And your pelvic floor is like a really shallow soup bowl, but like a big soup bowl, you know what I mean? Like but a shallow one. And so when we take a breath in, those 2 domes, so I call this dome breathing, the 2 domes should drop down to the floor or down to the chair. And then as you exhale, it should rebound and recoil back up. And so it usually takes about 2 or 3 breaths to be like, what is my physio asking me to do? And so give it a moment. But that space between the 2 domes shouldn't change. They should not organically, but they should move down together and then come back up together. So just take a moment. This is so funny.
Is this different than hill breathing?
Yes, this is different. Than
Oh, because I was like, I know.
Are
Crush
we
the hill
breathing in our
breathing.
mics?
Okay. Yes.
So we're just taking big breaths.
Yeah, we're taking big breaths. Not even real big breaths. We're taking kind, simple breaths. As we breathe in, can we feel those 2 plates drop down to the floor? And then as we exhale, do we feel them move back up again?
I don't know.
I know this is super counterintuitive, isn't it? We assume that as we inhale, that pelvic floor muscle will lift, but it actually does the opposite. That muscle has to lengthen, and then it has to use its elastic recoil and rebound to come up and stabilize again. We can't have a powerful or efficient contraction of any muscle if it doesn't ever lengthen and shorten again. And so often the pelvic floor is a little bit high tone or it's a little bit tight, but most often it's because there's a pressure system pushing on it. So if someone was sitting on my shoulders, my husband was sitting on my shoulders all day, I might be the first hour be like, I got this. I'm a strong person. But then by like hour 2, my knees would start to buckle and then I would fail, right? And so that's what happens with the pelvic floor is it can no longer have this beautiful orchestra of movement that is allowed to contract and relax as we move through our day and take a step and another step. And so if something's always binding and bearing it down, then the pelvic floor can't move well. And then we start to see signs like hip pain, because the hip is like, well, if you're not stable or you're too gripped, then I'm going to have to do more. And then all of a sudden, why does my hip hurt all the time? Or why does my back hurt all the time? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so common injuries or pain that actually is coming from the pelvic floor. So you said hip pain, often back pain. What are some other?
Those are the two big ones.
Okay.
There's such a fascinating stat that 96% of people with low back pain have a pelvic floor impairment. And when I say impairment, they maybe don't get those two domes to drop at the same time. Their deep inner core muscles aren't firing because there's too much pressure. Or there's a twist of the pelvis that's not allowing the pelvic floor to work like it should. And so 96%, that's a 1-in-1 ratio.
That's
1
wild.
in 3 gymnasts at the elite level will pee their pants without control. 1 in 3, that's crazy. So 1 in 4 high performance dancers have some pelvic floor dysfunction that might leak without control. And so when you hear those stats in the sport world, you start to say, whoa, is this a culture in sport? Is this an overtraining issue? Is this a lack of mindfulness and connection? Is there time? Is there permission? What are we doing that's not allowing athletes to connect the way they organically could, right? And imagine if we taught this at the age of 16, right? And I'm grateful that I get to teach this to 16-year-old athletes, not necessarily like as I would a postpartum mom. Well, kind of it is the same, but obviously they're not used to having conversations about themselves like this. So I do that with a lot of grace and kindness, and just connecting to the pelvis and connecting to the hips in a way that's appropriate for their level. But imagine if we taught that at a younger age, right? Imagine if you had some awareness on how your pelvic floor functions. So when it wasn't kind of serving you, or like, what can I do now? Why is that? And then be like, hey, where's my breath at? Oh, those domes aren't moving at all. My best job is I get to teach this every day. And then it's a check-in for my pelvic health. So it's a preventative strategy for me. And so it's like, okay, you know what? Why isn't that breathing well? Oh, that was a terrible week. Why was that a terrible week? Well, this happened. My daughter's sick. I've got a cough. Well, guess what? That cough will really impact how my pelvic floor moves. Maybe I should check up on this again in a couple weeks.
Everything is so intertwined. So when you started really learning and focusing on pelvic floor care and pelvic health, is that when you chose to make the transition to creating a clinic that's women-centered? Because you do see male patients as well. Andrew has been to see Kim as well.
And I'm going to sound so dumb, but I don't even care. When you were like, do pelvic floor on a man, I was like, what? But I understand how you get there. But I'm like, I would have never thought. Like, I would have thought it's...
Well, we always talk
Women's
about
issue.
regarding
With
women.
yeah,
Is what
right?
you more
Women
hear.
in pregnancy is what I would think, right?
Yeah.
Like not realizing that it could affect young athletes who have never had children and you know what I mean? Or people in general.
A lot of men come see me for performance gains in the sport of running. Let's just be clear on that. And so or the sport of running or of sport. And so usually men that come see me, they want to keep running well, or they want to keep being active, or they have a knee injury and they want to. So I don't often do pelvic floor exams on men. There's a great woman in the city that I will refer to do some of the prostate stuff, the cancer stuff. And, I kind of stick to my niche, which is sport performance, or, just postpartum work as well. And so when men come to see me, they're usually like, something's making me not be as fit or fast as strong as I want to be. And so often, and I remember teaching this course back in the day called the Mindful Runner. And one thing I taught was breath work every week. And I remember teaching, there was 2 men to like 7 or 8 females in this running course, and I taught pelvic floor breathing, and they're like, we're out. And I was like, no, you have one too. Guess what? And I remember the look on one of this guy's face is like, you want me to what? And I was like, well, your situation is different. Your job is to drop your balls. And he's like, okay. And he's just like, okay, Kim, and then poor guy was just standing there with all these women. And I was like, well, you have one too. And that will ultimately affect how you race. And so now that is also something, it's like a tight pelvic floor on a female. It's not going to help you. It's not going to serve you. And the same thing holds for a man's sport performance.
Well, and I remember when I was having It was my daughter because I was having back pain and I was like, I need help. And I went to physio and I went to a sport rehab place because that's what I knew. And the guy was like, okay, so like, this is what I think you need. He's like, I think you need like pelvic floor work. And I was like, great. Like, when do I book that in? He's like, well, I'm going to refer you. And I like had no idea. I was like, why won't he just like, I don't understand. And then one of my friends was like, they're going to go inside of you. Like, that's probably why he's like actually not trained on how to do this. But I remember talking to the physiotherapist and I would like said something about kegels and I was like preparing to have a baby. And she was like, you want your pelvic floor to like flow. And we tell all these pregnant women to do kegels, tighten it up, tighten up. She's like, you're literally now teaching your body to hold in when you're about to push something out of it. Like, just think about that concept for a second. And I was like,
totally.
That makes so much sense. And I think it's why, TMI everyone here, but I share a lot. Like, I had great deliveries. And I think it was prepping my floor to like move well and relax and do what it needed to do.
Yeah. It's very rare that I give a Kegel in the clinic. I will give them the dome breath because what's fascinating about the dome breath, well, there's an extra part to the dome breath, but that extra part, when I'm doing an internal exam, I'll get them to do that breath work and I can feel if it's breathing well, the pelvic floor will contract around my fingers and it will lift. And that's not my patient saying, hey, you should contract and lift and you should do a Kegel. It's happening autonomically. It's happening automatically. And that's what life is supposed to be. It's supposed to organically anticipate load. It's supposed to be like, she's going to lift that. I'm ready for her, right? And so doing those Kegels are kind of a training system against the grain. I know I was like, maybe I do give a Kegel. I'm like, no, I don't. I really don't. I really don't. If I'm creating an environment that moves with ease and there's fluidity and movement and the breath works, and then I've trained what I call high pressure and low pressure. I train the trunk of us to have a solid base that the pelvic floor can work off of. When I do the right things, that Kegel is like a light switch turns on and it just does its thing.
I remember doing my first exam and that's exactly what happened. And she was like, you're going to breathe. And I was like, and then she'd be like, great, you did it. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she's like, no, she's like, just, and she trained me on how to be like, do this. Like you'll, when you start to feel it, you'll know, which is why when we were doing it, I was like, I can feel what's happening because I did it for a long time, but it is just like really training, I think, to like, it's so hard because it's so like literally deeply inside of you. Yeah. And you have to like really get in tune, I feel.
And it doesn't really take much, surprisingly. It just takes a couple understandings of breath, which, you think how hard can breathing be? And it's not when you have the right cues. And when you kind of cue it appropriately, it'll come. And then this high pressure training, I teach how to create a little bit of pressure outward into the back and the abdominal wall and the sides. And all that's doing is it's stressing the system. So the pelvic floor is like, what am I supposed to do? So when something happens, like when you start running, your pelvic floor is like, I've been here before. I've been stressed under a controlled environment. I know exactly what to do. And then that's when you start to see the pelvic floor react appropriately. And what happens when the pelvic floor reacts appropriately, we start to see, you'll hear me say things like running is the art of letting go. You'll start to see the rib cage rotate freely. You'll start to see the hip let go. You'll see a faster pace. You'll see a longer stride. All these things start to come together because you now have a stable platform to work off of.
I have a selfish question. So when Tammy was on our podcast, she actually quoted you, but she didn't realize who she was quoting. But do you remember when Tammy said somebody told her that you actually become a better runner after 40? That was Kim.
Yes.
That was Kim. So as someone who has always liked the idea of running and tried not very hard to become a runner years ago, how would you tell somebody like me who's like wanting to start running where to start? Because it sounds to me like there's a lot more than just putting on your running shoes and moving.
There is a lot more. However, that's my job, right? That's my job. And so if my runners hear all the things that I just said, they'd be like, oh, she talks about a little bit of that. But like, those are the things that I need to think about in order for someone to be successful, right? they might just know that they have to do a couple breaths, right? And then they'll feel the changes. Sometimes that's all the information they need to know, right? Because it could be super overwhelming knowing I'm thinking of this and this and this and this and this and this and this, right? But now we're kind of talking about not necessarily pelvic floor.
And is this more now stepping into like preventative care? Like I'm thinking with your question, you're like, okay, I've decided I want to be a runner. So maybe I'm going to come to you to get preventative, like how to care for my body while in the process of learning to be a runner?
I think so. It's like, what are the right ways to start running and not like just end up injured, not knowing, I'm going to push through this when that's the wrong move.
Okay. So it's sometimes tricky because sometimes when I train a runner, sometimes I don't talk about the pelvic floor or anything because maybe I don't need to.
Hey everybody, it's Erica here. So Father's Day is right around the corner. And if the dads in your life are hard to buy for, then I have you covered, friends. I want to talk to you about a brand that you've probably seen on my page. I'm typically wearing a hat in my dancing farm videos, Prairie Proud. Prairie Proud has the most amazing selection of prairie-inspired apparel that the dads in your life are going to love. I'm not kidding when I tell you that when I need a Father's Day gift for my dad, my father-in-law, and my hubby, it's a one-stop shop for me. Prairie Proud gear is a staple in our family. And you guys know I love to support local business, so I'm always happy to go in, have a little chat with Cole, and pick up some amazing products. Prairie Proud just actually came out with a new design that I'm very excited to go and shop this Father's Day, and it's called the Home Quarter. If you're a farm family, you know what I'm talking about. The other amazing thing about Prairie Proud, besides their quality in products and designs, is that they are pouring back into the community through charity contributions. Prairie Proud has so many great gift options for Father's Day. Like I mentioned, the Home Quarter Crew t-shirt and also the Compass Crew sweater is definitely on my list to go and check out. And did I mention that the men's sizes are unisex, so you can totally steal whatever you get him from out of his closet? It's basically a win-win no matter what. You guys, we also have a code for you to use to make Father's Day shopping even easier. Enter DAD at checkout online for 15% off your purchase. You can also check out the Prairie Proud accessories. You'll find hats, beanies, mugs, and socks too. They even have a tab online where you can find matching options so the kids can match with Dad. Check out all the new Prairie Proud spring arrivals in person at their Broadway storefront in Saskatoon or shop online at prairieproud.ca. And remember to use the code DAD for 15% off at checkout. That's 15% off using the code DAD at checkout. Happy shopping, everybody.
But what happens is sometimes when we're new to running technique, running stamina comes with running. And so there's going to be no perfect technique when you're starting day one all the way up for a good year. There's no perfect technique. And so sometimes I don't worry my patients about the technique all the time because it will get better and better as we do more. There are a couple things like I will make sure they're starting on the right track, like cadence work, which is really the most number one thing, which is how many steps you take per minute. But I just always ensure that they're following a program. The most common running program that fails is 0 to 5K because it's often done too fast. So most 5K programs need to be 8 to 10 weeks long. They need to take time to load the tissues. Okay.
So what would that look like running every day for a certain amount of time to work up to 5?
No, God, no. Who's got time for that?
Nobody.
Right.
Hence why I've never actually done it.
So on a perfect world, I would say I want you to run 3 days a week and it'll gradually progress. It might be like run 30 seconds and then walk for 2, run 30 seconds. And then eventually you'll get up to 5 minutes continuous. And then you maybe do a 5 minute with a 2 minute walk and then a 5 minute again. And then it'll go with like 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 30. So it gradually progresses over time. And I bet you every patient that I've ever gotten to do a running program with in that new field, they're like, I see where this program's going. There's no way I'm going to get there. And I said, trust my process. And they do. And it always is successful if they're listening to their body, right? If they're being respectful with that.
Would you give the same running advice to men and women?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. We could go into that conversation about hormones and hormonal health with training. And we could go that deep into that conversation, but it's very rare that I It's very, I usually keep it the same.
Okay, and you've just bred hormones, so now this sparked a question to me. But like our cycle, like do you have running programs built around the cycle that women experience? Because obviously, like we're ovulating and we're like, let's go, and then we have our period and we're like, no one
See you
touch me,
later.
I don't want to do anything.
Yeah.
So do you ever take that into account?
Absolutely. However, hormonal health in sport has been around for a long time, a really long time, and hormonal health on Instagram has become very popular, right? And so this is a conversation, a dietitian that I know quite well, a sport nutritionist that I know we've talked about for years, her and I. And what's really hard, and it depends on who you're talking about. If I'm talking to a pre-Olympic athlete and I'm saying, guess what? You're not going to perform your best the week before your cycle. Do you know what that's going to do to them if they have a competition that weekend? It's not going to go well, right? It's just one more barrier to their self, right? And so I have to be very careful who I share information with, because that could easily take an athlete down, easily. So when people ask me about hormonal health, if they're just, women like us that are like, why are some of my runs really bad? And I was like, well, we can pay attention to your cycle. If it's the week before, it's very likely that you're not regulating heat very well. You're not regulating fluid very well. Maybe it was a super hot day that week and you didn't actually sleep. And so you start to think like, I'm not actually a really crappy runner. It was just all these things together. And then they'll notice, oh, that week went by really well. The next week, I had this conversation yesterday with one of my runners for the SAS Marathon. She's like, I was really worried because I was doing 30K and I was so hard. What if I can't do the full marathon? And I said, well, where were you in your cycle? And she goes, oh, yes. And I was like, girl, it's just a thing, you know?
Which to me would feel like giving me grace.
Absolutely.
Because when I go to my home gym and I crushed it for 2 weeks, and then I go in and I'm like, I can barely do a half hour of walking on the treadmill. And I'm like, it feels like it's killing me. It helps me to know that and be like, this is not you have not lost something. This is your body is like probably out of whack for a little bit.
Exactly.
But I could understand if you tell someone who maybe can't mentally, not that the people you're telling to can't mentally process it, but like a young pre-Olympic athlete they're young.
Some
Which
of
I'm
them,
just thinking
but
about,
there's
like,
some older ones.
Athletes now and women athletes. And I'm like,
Do they have a cycle?
I'm just like, whoa, like things that you just do not stop and think about. And I'm like, they don't get to choose when they get to compete, right?
No.
They don't get to choose when these things happen and how that affects it. And I'm like, that is a whole new barrier that I'm just literally sitting here like,
But a lot
even
of
process that.
colleges in the States now will track their athletes' cycles, and they'll say, your workout this week is this, your workout is this week, because they're wanting to work with their hormonal health, not against it. And so it is kind of giving them this mental preparation that if they do have a race and it happens to be in the competitive time or it happens to be that week before, they're not getting hit by coaches saying, what the hell was that?
Yeah.
Right.
The
For
coaches
them saying it to themselves.
Exactly,
They can actually go,
Exactly.
but I understand the line of you don't want someone to be like, well, I had a bad run because I had my period. Right? You're like, okay, what's the line here of understanding your body, working with your body, working with what you can do. And sometimes things happen and you go, okay, so now we learn from it. I can see that.
Yeah. Or just like that run went really poorly. Guess what? That's fine.
To come off of that, you teach women the mindset of intentional training.
Yeah.
What are the pieces of that?
Be intentional. No.
Be intentional.
The end.
I'm teasing about that. So I find, like we talked about the culture of sport, more is always more. And I find I don't necessarily need to give 15 exercises because we might just blow through the purpose and the why of them. And so if that's what they want, which some people come in and I say, okay, I'm going to give you an hour program because that's what works for your life and that is something you want to do. All those programs have intention. I create these programs based on what is something that they're not moving well with. How can I connect to that? So when you're doing the activity you love, you've already trained that in a controlled environment that it will progress organically into the activity that you love to do. And so it's interesting. I always videotape I use my patient's phone because that would take so much data and it's HIPAA violation, all these other things. So I take their phone and I videotape them doing their exercises because there are a lot of cues. And I'd rather give one exercise with 5 cues than 15 exercises with no cues and see success in 2 weeks and success in 4 months. So
can you explain to me what you mean by like one exercise with 5 cues?
Right. So if someone's doing a deadlift or something. So I had this postpartum mom that came to see me and she was super interested in strength and conditioning before she had her baby as baby 1. And so the first 2 sessions working with her, I taught her a couple things about the domes and how breath work works. And then what I call that high pressure, so I can build this trunk so it has the pelvic floor has something to work off of. So that 3rd session, we started to go over strength training. And so one thing that I wanted to look, because it's the number one injury or strength exercise that creates injury, is her deadlifts. And she loves doing deadlifts. And so we took a moment to do the deadlift, and she happened to be what I call a rib flare. So she kind of happened to like stick out her chest a little bit while she was moving into the deadlift. And then she would stick her rib cage out even more to stand back up. And the second you stick out your rib cage, you actually lose that dome coordination pretty instantly, and you actually create a lot of postural weakness. And so just by her like doing some dome breathing before her deadlift and cueing her not to rib flare and just soften her ribs, her pelvis and her hip moved way better. And so she's like, God, that feels better. And I was like, exactly. So now we're teaching you appropriate alignment and posture. So when you go do something postpartum, you've already connected these dots again, and you're not going to be my patient in a year. Hopefully you're my patient in a year to be like, now what?
Yeah.
What's next?
It's wild how the smallest little changes that we would never consider, but when you just stand and watch somebody, you can see all of these things, and how the smallest cue can really make it a completely different movement for them.
Right. So it is sometimes really mindful, intentional work, and sometimes it's exhausting. So I'd rather give them a couple of exercises, and then they have the video. So they literally hear my sweet voice and they put it on the floor and they're like, oh yeah, are my ribs soft? Am I still breathing? And then they start to pay attention to those cues. And then once they build that patterning, then I'm going to give them 10 more things. You know, once I build that control system and patterning, then we're good to go, right?
That makes so much sense to me because I follow this one trainer on social media right now, and I love how, and I think he's like weight training, but he talks about, first of all, what you've said, which is like, if someone has capacity for an hour workout, great, let's work that. But I barely have time for an hour workout. So how do we be really intentional with your workout instead of trying to get you to do, you know, it's like the difference of sometimes like maybe you'll do a HIIT workout, but then the next time you're going to go nice and slow and steady because you want to be really mindful of what you're doing with your body. And then you also said about how you'll train something in one area and it'll just ripple out into the rest of their programming or their sports, which I spoke to a guy once who said he was doing a triathlon. He said, I had my running and my biking down and my swimming not. So he said, all I did was train my swimming and my other 2 got better.
Absolutely.
Which is like, I think we forget that we forget it's like going to ripple out into the rest of our lives and our performance, even outside of like physical, right?
I train this stuff, this high pressure, this low pressure, this pelvic floor education for every sport. It's applicable for every sport. And so I do. And obviously it will change, like a swimmer's pull has to live off rotation. So how do I do that? And so what do I need to think about that they're hitting these elements, but they're hitting it with ease and not moving against the grain?
So how can we, as we continue to like kind of ebb and flow through like this conversation, protect our pelvic floor as and I'm going to be selfish as 3 women sitting here, you know, who are all active within our, I mean, none of us are like running.
Yeah.
I used to run, but not anymore. But I'm like, how can we protect our pelvic floor? Like you taught us this little breathing thing. I know obviously come to you because you're the professional, but is there anything that you'd be like, here's something to be mindful of or something to look for? I think you were kind of asking that, like, I said to you today, my back hurts. Like I was training yesterday. Like what can I look for to be mindful of that?
So you said that perfectly. If you're having like a chronic back issue or a hip issue, or you're finding you're chronically constipated, nothing seems to be getting better, or you're always bloated, or you're always having belly issues, that could be a sign of pelvic floor issues. And then also there's obviously the pelvic floor ones that are obvious, right? But what are we supposed to do? So someone recently said to me, what's the formula? What am I supposed to do to make sure that I'm, you know, my 18-year-old athletes can turn into 50-year-old athletes that can turn into 71-year-old people? And I said, well, it's not really a formula, but here's what I think about all day long, every day, is what are you doing that's keeping you stable, mobile, and strong? And so we often train strength, but we don't very often train stability, that breath work, mobility, right? And so I created something. This is a plug on my end. I created a thing called it's called Deep Inner Core and Pelvic Floor series on my online platform. So a lot of my people will do that once a week. And I'm actually just creating a postpartum series that new moms can start to retrain this high pressure meets low pressure and start to build that breath work, because sometimes it's really hard to see me when there's just me, but there's other pelvic floor therapists, but it's such a hard time to make those appointments work. So when we go back to what do we need to do that we could be our age, but then that next decade that we can move with ease and be active with ease, is those three components. Are we doing something with mobility, stability, and strength? Now wait, that doesn't all have to be at once, right? Mm-hmm. We have different seasons in our life. We have the physical seasons, like summer, we're going to do more things. We're going to bike with our kids. We're going to do these things, right? So maybe in the off season, I call it, maybe January, February, we're like, I'm going to do a couple months of yoga. I'm just going to work on some mobility work. I'm going to do this online stuff, or I'm going to do some Pilates. We have such great Pilates studios. There's a new one on 20th. I can't wait to check out. And so Pilates is mobility, stability, and strength all in one, which is why I love it. And I recommend a lot of my people to take it. And then if they're doing some HIIT class or the strength class or the booty bar class at local bar, then you're getting that strength component and stability programs and stability component. So we first of all figure out what makes us happy, what gives us joy. Because I could be like, girl, you need this and you need to do it 3 days a week and they're going to be an hour long, and you're going to be like, got it, chief. And you're going to hate it. And then it's going to not be sustainable. So that's one thing I really learned is actually listen to your patients and be like, what do you want? Because I'm going to spend time creating this and you're going to hate it. So let's figure out what you want to do and how do we incorporate that in. And maybe 5 minutes before your Pilates class, let's just do these 2 exercises to make it better. Right? So it doesn't have to be this massive program. It just is like, what are the things you need to add in to fill in the circle, or my pillars, I call them, of stability, mobility, and strength. What
do you find is the thing that stops people from getting the care that they need?
Right. Money. Physio is expensive. Chiro is expensive. Massage is expensive, but benefits haven't really changed much. And so that's a big barrier to people's recovery. That's massive time, right? You know, we all have steady lives. It fluctuates in busy and less busy, but it's pretty chronically steady, right? Mm-hmm. And so sometimes, I'll be honest, after my kids all get their appointments, I don't want an appointment for me. I'm tired, right? And so that's a big one. Those are the 2 big ones I find. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you could say things like, oh, it's an investment on your health, but you know, sometimes you just don't have the funds, or sometimes there's things that are more important. Like my daughter needed glasses. There was $800 right there. And you're just like, okay, that's where that's at, you know? Mm-hmm. So how do we make this accessible? And there's tons of times where I'll say, which is one of the reasons I created my Deep Inner Core series, that price is equivalent to, like, I think it's 6 sessions for $159 and an hour with me is $150. Mm-hmm. So it's like, why don't you come see me? I'll see you twice, maybe the first time to get things moving well. Go do that for the next 6 weeks, 7 weeks. Let's check in, see where we're at. And then I'm going to give you something next and I'll follow up with you. So it's not that they're seeing me twice a week for 7 weeks. Like, that would never happen anyway. But time and money, I think, would be the hardest thing.
Mm-hmm. I feel like if I can speak to, because even after I got all my pelvic floor work done, I was kind of the first of my friends to have kids. And so then after, of course, every time my friend would get pregnant, I'd be like, you gotta go do the pelvic floor work. Like, oh my gosh, right? Like, do this. And I think there's even just such an unknown to what that is.
Right.
Right. And I feel like after my first baby, I was like, who else wants a look? Because you're just kind of like on display for everybody at some point in your pregnancy, right? But that first time is like really intimidating to be like, I'm going to go and sit in an office and this girl is going to massage my vagina for 30 minutes. Like when you say that, you're like, sorry, what kind of clinic is this? Right. And I
Shut the blinds.
yeah, you're like, we don't let people, exactly. So I would think that another hurdle that I experienced while talking with friends was like, my pelvic floor, it's just not even knowing what it is, and we have it, and that it matters, right? And really educating what you're doing today, which is educating on it, so people can go, this is like a real thing that I need to be mindful of. As I do, I can only speak really to the baby aspect, but all of it.
But it's crazy to think that car seat, that is so ergonomically not friendly, right? That heavy car seat that you have to carry and then you have to rotate and put it in. Like, I don't know how we survive that with a pelvic floor that's like, what just happened to me? Like, what?
Yep.
And so, you learn these things, and that's why I'm creating that online series, so I can teach this, what they can start to work on. So when they're ready to see me or they have clearance to see me, I'm like, hey, have you worked on this? And they're like, yeah, I'm already halfway down that series. I'm like, perfect. So my job is to do the pelvic floor exam. We're going to see where we're at.
Well, and I wonder, going on a tangent, like I had a C-section with my first baby, and I remember being given the instructions on like what I could do, what I couldn't do, blah, blah, blah. And I followed it to a T. I was like, great. Like I'm not holding anything except the baby. And now in my head, as you're sitting here saying that about, picking up the car seat, I'm like, why aren't even just in general after having a baby, we given this like, hey, you maybe are going to feel okay because maybe you didn't tear. Maybe your labor and delivery was great. You got this baby love hormones going through your body right now. Breast, it's all the best case scenario, but your body just went through something. And I remember starting to run 2 to 3 weeks after my daughter, and I had my SI joint went out after her.
Because there was no integrity of that pelvic floor.
And I remember running, and I ran for a really long time. And then by the time I got to a place where I was like, I need physio because something's going on with my knee. I was talking to a guy about it, and he's like, when did you start running? And I told him, and he was the one that was like, whoa, your body was like, your hips probably weren't even back in place. Like, he's like, you went to do something, and your body's like, I've never been in this physical position before. And I'm like, I feel great now, right? Everything's back in order. SI joints back. Like, we're good. And just that educational piece about like what your body does through pregnancy and then after.
I know, it's crazy. And like I said before, pelvic floor is out of sight, out of mind. So how the heck do you even know how it's coordinating or restoring balance again? You really don't know until someone assesses that and they're like, you know what? I expect this, but this is a little bit off. So let's pay attention to this. And then, I remember I got in trouble once because I said pregnancy is like an injury. Oh, did I ever get in trouble for that?
Who gave you trouble for that?
One of the doctors. And I said, if I had a hamstring tear, there's no way I would return to sport 6 weeks post, like
right
to life, to sport. And why do we think that these women are returning to activity 6 weeks post? It takes 8 to 12 weeks for tissues to heal. So why do we assume that I get this checkbox clearance at 6 weeks?
Yeah.
So when people come to see me, I said, you know what? It takes 8 to 10 to 12 weeks to rehab from the birth. Just the birth.
Wow.
And then we're going to start talking about how to recoordinate that. And for some reason, it takes 6 months for that switch thing I told you about to turn back on. So if someone comes to see me at 3 months and I test their pelvic floor strength and it's kind of wishy, I'm not worried about it because it's going to organically find its way if we're training all the right things.
Well, and that's goes back to that, like, how do we take the pressure off to be like, it's all good. Like, you're not where you were, but your body also, it went through this huge change, and injuries included. I'm only speaking to what I really know. And it's just such a wild thing to think about our bodies not going through an injury when I'm like, oh yeah, I had great, other than my SI joint, which was a whole thing, but like pretty decent deliveries, like really have nothing to complain about. But then, in my head, I'm like, I didn't have an injury. I'm fine. I'm good.
But you don't know until you know.
But you don't know until you're like, that feels off.
Right. Or you're a patient that would see me 1 year post and you're like, what the heck? Why is this bugging me all the time? Why am I not making progress with how I feel? And then we're postpartum forever. We're always postpartum.
That's a really good point.
I know. And I think that point scares people because they're like, oh, because we associate postpartum as maybe a bad thing. But in my world, like postpartum is like freaking beautiful. I think it's so cool that this pelvic floor can support us and nourish us. And if we just nurture it, it's crazy what it'll do for us.
I saw a thing the other day on social media, which maybe you're going to be like, don't put this in the episode because that's a lie. But it was a girl and she was talking about the amount of time it takes for a woman's body to like heal from a birth. And it was something like, correct me if I'm wrong or if you don't even know what I'm talking about. It was something like 2 years.
2 years.
2 years for your body. And then they said, and now add on, you've now had your body 2 years. Like my son was 11 months when I got pregnant with my next.
Yep.
So they're like, you add on an additional, basically they're like, it's 2 years for your first and then you tack on like 2 plus something because like now the trauma. And this girl was going off because she had 5 kids. She's like, it's going to take me like 20 years.
Yeah.
And she's like, let that sink in that I will probably never ever be the person like I like my body. And that sunk in for me that I was like, it's so unrealistic for me to be like, I used to look like that. Like never.
Well, one of my best friends will have a baby by the time that this airs, and I told her, you know, because we were talking about like how long is it going to take until I feel like myself again and whatever, and I said, quite honestly, and this is just my experience, I didn't feel settled again in my physical body for 3 years.
Yeah. They say 2 to 3 years for hormonal regulation, not including when you were pregnant.
Yeah.
Which is crazy, right? It's not a stat I share on a piece of paper with all my postpartum women to say, girl, it's going to take you 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
But I do give women grace to be like, this ain't working this week and that's fine.
Yeah.
You know, this is fine. This is why you're going to feel this way for this amount of time. And there's no pressure to perform here. Let's just release that.
Yes. And like for all these women who probably had babies in like January and February and they're like, beach season is coming. And it's like, take that off your plate because no matter probably, and not to be like, no matter how hard you work, but I'm like if you work so hard to get to a place where you're bathing suit ready, what are the injuries that might come after?
Right.
Because you haven't given yourself time to heal. So like that grace and that healing. Oh, I just love that.
Yeah. At what cost?
At what cost? Exactly. Okay. So sometimes I'll write the word ego and I'll put a heart on it or around it and I'll put an arrow through it. And then I smile at my patients. And I remember I did tell my husband I did this and he's like, you write that on people's program? And I said, ego restricts progression. Ego prevents progression. And he goes, oh, that's really good.
Yeah.
And I write it with a heart and a smile and a kind soul. Because when we were like, I'm just going to keep pushing, I'm tough, I'm strong, I'm going to go for this, that's when we injure ourselves. You know, when we stop listening to ourselves and be like, I'm going to rest, I'm going to watch Netflix, I'm going to fill my cup with Mexican chili chips, like that's what I'm going to do, then that's when we start to improve, right?
Yeah.
And so, yes, I kindly write the word ego, or I'll say, this is like the interval runs, bring that ego out. You own that run. You run hard, you run fast. But that long, easy paced run, put that ego back, set your watch to a slow race time, and then just sit back and enjoy it.
That feels like a beautiful place to
I think so.
wrap up, right?
Yeah.
So we like to end. You've given us so much, by the way. I've really enjoyed this conversation. You're the first person who's ever given us an exercise to do.
Dome breathing.
Dome breathing. Yes, I
love
love
it.
this. No, this is so good. We like to end the episode by asking if you can share a really great piece of advice that you've received or that you like implement in your life.
Oh my gosh, yes. There's one that I just love. So I heard this. I was taking this, masterclass. Yeah, so we had masterclass for a while. There was a really good deal. It was like 2 for 1. I can't remember. And it was the editor-in-chief of Vogue, Anna Wintour. It's like Anna Wintour.
I wanted to watch that one so bad.
I've watched it probably 6 times.
Wow.
And it happened to be at a time where I was leaving that busy clinic and I was deciding to start my own. And I'd already started my name. I think I had Still Physio written down. And she said, it was so freaking good. She said, if you keep looking at what the people to the left of you are doing and you look at what the people to the right of you are doing, you will lose clarity. I want you to plant your flag and I want you to put it high and I want you to look ahead. And I said, okay, I'll do it.
Anna.
I'll do what you say. And that's so true. And I had this really great racer and it was one of her comeback races for the New York City Marathon. And she was performing and competing against people she had ran with 10 years ago. And she's like, oh God, how do I not see this and feel like I'm not worthy of being here? I'm not capable of being here. I've had this injury. What am I supposed to do? And I told her that. I said, I don't want you to look at the people on the left or the right. I want you to plant your flag. Because how often were we told when we were young, I'm going to put my head down and I'm going to work hard. Now I never put my head down. My head is high. There's my flag. That's where I will go. And so I think that a lot.
I love that. For people who are just meeting you, because you're probably new for a lot of our followers, can you tell them where to find you and how they can work with you?
Okay. So I'm a one-man show. So I work on Broadway. So my business name is Still Physio. And they can go on my website, stillphysio.ca or .com. Oh God. I don't know.
One of the two.
One of the two.
We'll link it in the show
Yes.
notes.
Yeah. And then I also have this online platform called STILL PHYSIO Education. And so just keep an eye out for that. I offer some breathwork series on there. I offer this deep inner core and pelvic floor series. And then that platform is going to be where I continue to teach. And so I'll be teaching to individuals that want to learn, but I'm also going to start teaching to other healthcare providers to say like, here are my thoughts. You can do what you want with them, but see where it goes, see where it takes you. Be curious.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming.
welcome.
This was a great conversation.
Good. Okay.
Yes, it's like so value packed.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Thank you, Kim.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this episode of the Her Podcast. If you want to follow along with us, you can find us on Instagram and TikTok at its.her.podcast. We can't wait to see you there.
Bye.
Adios.